Hi everybody, Terry Ryder from Hot Spotting. This week the latest official price data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics has been published, and what's interesting about those figures, amongst other things, is that the numbers are a lot more optimistic and bullish than the figures most commonly quoted, which is the data from CoreLogic. What the latest official figures from the Bureau of Statistics show is that in annual terms, house prices are up in 5 of the 8 capital cities, and that the capital city average is an annual decline of less than 2% for houses and even less for apartments. Those figures are interesting because they're in contrast to the figures that are most often quoted in mainstream media, the figures from CoreLogic. For example, CoreLogic's latest figures for Sydney have house prices down more than 9%. The latest figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics have the Sydney price decline of 4.9%. So approximately half the rate of decline that's been recorded by CoreLogic. And for Melbourne, whereas CoreLogic has Melbourne house prices down by about 6% in annual terms, the Australian Bureau of Statistics says they're down just 2.1%. And that is interesting. Media, for a number of reasons, tends to quote the figures from CoreLogic more than anyone else, primarily because CoreLogic pumps out press releases every day. And media these days, and particularly in their reporting of the housing market issues, is very press release driven, unfortunately. Gone are the days of real journalism when it comes to reporting this very important housing industry. So they tend to be the most negative figures anywhere out there. There's multiple sources of price data. Media doesn't acknowledge this very often. They report each set of data that comes out, particularly the CoreLogic figures, as fact. Well, they're not fact. They're just one set of numbers from one source using a particular methodology. There are a number of different sources. We have the Bureau of Statistics, we have the Real Estate Institute, we have SQM Research, we have Domain, we have CoreLogic, and there are others. But the figures most often quoted are the most negative ones, which says something about the mentality of your typical journalist reporting on the real estate industry. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics are in some ways similar to the CoreLogic numbers. The most recent figures from CoreLogic show, like these figures, that prices in annual terms and in monthly terms are up in 5 of the 8 capital cities. These figures, the latest figures out this week from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, shows that prices are up in 5 of the 8 capital cities, and the residential price indexes are also up in 5 of the 8 capital cities in quarterly terms, because they present figures for the most recent quarter and for the past year. So prices up in 5 of the 8 capital cities, whichever way you look at these numbers. What they show is that Hobart's up in terms of house prices. It's up strongly, 13%. Canberra's up moderately, about 4.5%. Brisbane and Adelaide are both up 2 to 2.5%, and Perth is just nudging into the positive again. That reflects figures from other sources, including SQM Research and the Real Estate Institute, showing that house prices in Perth are no longer falling. On average, the top end in Perth is actually rising quite strongly, which I think is the beginnings of a stronger cycle for Perth as we move into 2019. So positive numbers for Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide, Canberra and Hobart, including very strong numbers still for Hobart. Darwin still a little bit in the negative, less than 2% down. The latest CoreLogic figures actually have Darwin house prices back in the positive, but these ABS figures have Darwin still only slightly negative. Sydney is down 4.9% in terms of house prices, 3.3% in apartment prices, whereas Melbourne, house prices are down only 2%. And the Melbourne unit market, according to the ABS figures, still up slightly, up 0.7%, but for it to be up at all says something that something a little bit more positive that's happening in the Melbourne market than is generally portrayed in mainstream media. In terms of apartment prices, Hobart up strongly, Adelaide and Canberra up moderately, Melbourne up moderately, and slight declines in Brisbane and Perth. Darwin, the apartment market is still very much in the toilet. That's been a finding common across all the research sources. They still have Darwin house prices, whichever source you look at, down by at least 10% compared to 12 months ago. But overall, pretty positive numbers. Looking right across the country, the problem in the reporting of any price data at the moment is that media is generalising. They're looking at the average figure that capital cities, which is a negative figure because Sydney, according to the CoreLogic figures, is down a lot, and that drags down the city average. So the reports say house prices falling across Australia. Not true. The CoreLogic figures, similar to the Australian Bureau of Statistics latest figures out this week, show that in 5 of the 8 capital cities, whether you look at it monthly, quarterly, or annually, prices are still rising. And that's a fairly positive outcome given the negativity in mainstream media. So be mindful when you see price statistics reported in media that it's not fact, it's a snapshot according to one source, and media doesn't acknowledge, generally speaking, that there are other sources with different numbers. And though the numbers that came out this week from the Bureau of Statistics, quite different from those often quoted in media, generally speaking, a lot more positive and showing lesser levels of decline in the 2 biggest cities where prices are generally falling. Sydney down 4.9% in annual terms, and Melbourne down a fraction over 2%. That's it for now. Let's do it again soon.